Thanks for inviting me, Louise. It's really nice of you. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm aware I sound a bit like a mouse sometimes, so I'll try to speak up. So yes, as Louise explained, I'm from the CDAC Network. I'll tell you a bit more about them in a second. And yeah, the title of the presentation is How Best to Communicate with Communities Affected by Disaster. And I've focused really on determining needs, or trying to determine needs in Typhoon Haiyan of our member organisations. Our member organisations trying to determine needs in Typhoon. Oh, how did I go? I lost it. Okay, so briefly what I want to talk about is a quick introduction of what the CDAC network is. Briefly explain how our members responded generally when Typhoon Haiyan hit in the Philippines. In terms of needs assessment, so what did the agencies who are members of CDAC really need to know about communication? How did we try and find that out? What were the challenges in terms of needs assessment? How can crisis mapping help? I don't pretend to be an expert in crisis mapping. I'm sure there's people in this room that have more experience, but I just wanted to talk about it in this context. What did the needs assessment data show us, and how did this affect our programming, essentially? And then briefly talk about other uses of technology during the response to the typhoon. So the CDAC network, this represents all the members of the CDAC network. So it's quite a unique network of different INGOs, the ICRC as well, intergovernmental agencies, media development agencies who were really part of founding the network, and also some service and product providers. And increasingly we want to try to get more private sector involvement. So the CDAC network is, I think it's 21 organisations, and it was formed in 2009, basically in response to a policy paper from BBC World Service called Left in the Dark, which would basically highlighted the need for, there's an unmet need for information for affected communities in humanitarian response. So various organisations got together with the idea of improving two-way communication, basically between humanitarian responders and communities affected by disaster. So this is our membership now. We're constantly growing, trying to grow. The CDAC Network Secretariat is very small. We're 5 people. I'm the Research and Learning Officer. And actually the rest of, I've been there since May, and the rest of the staff came on in September. So we are quite new. So everything I'm kind of talking about in Typhoon Haiyan happened just as soon as the capacity of our team grew. So it was all a bit of an experiment, really. I just wanted to show you a quick animation. I wonder if some of you have seen this before. Has anyone heard of Info as Aid? Yeah? Okay, so Info as Aid were an organisation, it was a project really, set up by BBC Media Action and Internews, so 2 media development agencies within our membership. And it was a 2-year project to try to develop kind of tools and resources to help humanitarians communicate better with communities. And this is just a short animation, kind of, it explains really why our members think communication is part of the aid agenda. Now, I don't really know how I'm going to click on it, that's the only problem. Did that one? Shall I, this is it. Any idea?
The mouse was working earlier. So
does it work on the flat surface?
Oh, is it good on the surface?
No. Let me see if I can get
I'll tell you a bit more about Info as Aid while we wait. Info as Aid, actually, all their tools and resources are now on the CDAC Network website. And they developed a number of things. So one was an e-learning course, a short course for humanitarian actors, basically on what kind of things to think about in terms of communicating with affected populations. They developed media and telecoms landscape guides, which feedback is from a lot of people are very useful. They really tried to map out media and telecommunications situation in, I think it was 18 countries that were at highest risk of disaster or conflict. No. And they also created a message library, so with messages that could be useful. They talked to all the different clusters, so health, education, shelter, about messaging that might be useful to have kind of, I guess, predetermined messages before a crisis happens. Thank you. Okay, I'll show you the animation quickly. Oops, sorry. Oops, oops. Don't do it. It's bad with each other. There we go.
Communication. It's talking to a neighbor. It's emailing friends. It's catching up with the news. We all depend on giving and receiving information to share our experiences and feelings, steer our lives, and join us to our communities. In the eye of a crisis, whether it's natural or man-made, the communication networks that support every community can shatter along with resources and lives. And when all we rely on is turned upside down, we need information more than ever. It's as crucial as food, water, shelter, and medicine. Where can we go for help? What danger should we be aware of? How can we find our missing families and friends? And who will listen to our concerns and give us the advice we need? Insufficient or even conflicting information can cause confusion and worsen the feeling of isolation. And if we don't know and trust the sources, even the most vital messages can miss their mark. Lives can be saved with accurate, timely, and well-targeted information. When our voices are heard and we know what to expect, we can start to make our own decisions and get back in control of our lives. And once we can rebuild our familiar communication networks and then reconnect with the wider world, the process of recovery can really accelerate. The right information at the right time, through the right channels, can save families, livelihoods, and lives. It can give people back their futures. Communication is aid.
Okay, so that was really the kind of key advocacy message, I guess, of InfoSaid. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit now about Typhoon Haiyan. So obviously it was last November, the 8th of November, when Typhoon Haiyan made landfall. And it was the deadliest Philippine typhoon ever on record, and the strongest storm that was ever recorded when it made landfall. So, as we all know, it was a gigantic disaster. In this situation, obviously, most of the CDAC network members did deploy in some form or another because it was such a large-scale disaster, and many already had programs in the Philippines, and many decided to deploy at that time. So the CDAC Network Secretariat is not operational particularly, but what we were doing was we were involved in trying to broker relationships between the members. So if somebody was saying we need radios, we would be saying, okay, how about these guys, these can provide, and generally we were also involved in engaging with members about how we could advocate on their behalf to donors throughout the response, and in collating updates, so trying to find out who was doing what where and collating that information for the use of members and for the wider humanitarian sector. I wanted to share some case studies really, particularly focused on needs assessment from our members, and look at what kind of information they were trying to get and how they shared that and then used it. I wanted to show this image particularly because I think it highlights that even when the traditional communication channels are down, people are still always going to find ways to communicate what they need, and it's not necessarily through us deploying teams to go out to every area, but it's pretty clear what's needed in that picture, I think. Okay, so obviously food, water, and shelter were really the primary needs expressed in after the disaster. In terms of members of the CDAC network, so as you saw, there's various different NGOs and humanitarian responders in there. They're obviously trying to find out what needs are required in terms of food, water, shelter, all the healthcare, all of those needs. These questions were questions that we really wanted members to include basically in their needs assessment. So not above and beyond trying to find out what food and water, what the kind of life-saving needs were, but to try to find out how best to communicate with communities affected by disaster during their response. So really trying to think about what communication channels are available, in what way are we able to communicate with people, what information are people missing, so is there information that people really need to know and don't have access to, and what, how can we manage that? Particularly for the media development agencies, what is the damage to the existing media and communication channels? Because for the media development agencies, that's their core business, really. How can we help the media and communication channels get back up and running? So in terms of how we tried to get this particular data, interagency assessments, there was one question on the MIRA, which is the the intercluster rapid needs assessment. We also provided basically those questions to all members, asking them to include something along those lines in their needs assessments. So ActionAid, obviously Internews, who are a media development agency, and World Vision and UNFPA all did that. Map Action, does anyone know Map Action? Yeah, they're part of the Digital Humanitarian Network. They worked with Internews to try to map all the radio stations which were working, which were working, which weren't working, and also which they didn't know, and obviously a lot they couldn't find that information. The way that they collected that was through contacting people on the ground where they could, which obviously wasn't always easy, as communication channels were severely cut. I mean, it was really difficult to call people in the majority of the areas. So as their data sources here, they've got Pagasa, which is the weather control in Philippines, Internews, the Standby Task Force, and various different crisis mapping volunteer and tech communities, essentially. And what they've done in this map is they've tried to gather data from everywhere that they could, data scrambling basically, and put it into this map. Okay. So agencies, there was a multi-agencies needs assessments, and then individual agencies were trying to include these questions on their needs assessments. However, obviously, there's still many challenges, and that's to collecting data for needs assessment in general, not just for communications and information needs. The main challenge being access. So the UNDAC team, who usually aim to complete their needs assessment within the first 72 hours, apparently had real difficulty getting out of Tacloban and to any of the other areas. So given the communications and also the transport, all infrastructure was down, it was very difficult to assess those needs. Timeliness, 72 hours. Communication channels were down. So for the media development agencies, they want to deploy really as quickly as possible to get emergency radio stations up and running. In this situation, it was impossible to get any information within 72 hours. But as one of our members told me, if you can't get any information, chances are the communication channels are down. And for the media development agencies, that's kind of a sign to deploy as quickly as they can. A lot of the information that did come through obviously ended up being very later on, so I'm talking post 72 hours, within the first few weeks now, was very dependent on where member agencies were based. So where those assessments were taking place was essentially where member agencies were able to get to and where they were setting up their programmes. So the coverage was not complete by any means. There was also inconsistency of questions and methodologies. Given that every agency has its own priorities and its own focus, they're going to include the questions that are most relevant for them. And so even though we tried to suggest that those kind of two key questions about communication needs, communication channels and information needs were included, it was very varied as to who included what and in what way. Accuracy of information. Often it was really impossible for, it wasn't really possible to do a kind of full-on household survey, so it's really a case of talking to key informants and getting information from wherever possible, and not necessarily representative as well. So I wanted to just think a little bit about do people know about the Digital Humanitarian Network generally? I wanted to think a little bit about how the Digital Humanitarian Network or crisis mappers in general can help in this situation. So we've got a situation where the field teams on the ground are having difficulty accessing all the areas. There's a situation where tweets are coming in left, right and centre from different areas. And the Digital Humanitarian Network, basically, is a group of volunteer and technical communities. They can be activated by anybody, with good reason, obviously. And in this instance, they were activated by OCHA on the 7th of November, so just before Typhoon Haiyan made landfall. So once they were activated by OCHA, there was the Standby Task Force, the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, the GIS Corps, ESRI, Disaster Response Programme, Translators Without Borders, Statistics Without Borders, Info for Disaster, and some others who activated all their representative volunteers. And what the Digital Humanitarian Network sort of suggests it can help with is a list of things, really. So basically real-time media monitoring of mainstream and social media, rapid geolocation of event data and infrastructure data, creation of live crisis maps for decision support, which is essentially what OCHA were looking for in the initial stages, data development and data cleaning, GIS and big data analysis, satellite imagery tagging and tracing, and time-sensitive web-based research. So you basically have volunteers all over the world mobilised to try to manage information coming in from all over the social media and different networks. Is anyone familiar with micromappers? No? So I'm sure some of you will have heard of Patrick Meyer. So he's the Director of Social Innovation at the Qatar Foundation's Computing Research Institute. And he's really responsible for setting up micromappers, which was used in Haiti. So it's basically a tool that volunteers can use to sort through online data, so tweets or photos predominantly, and determine what's relevant, or what they believe to be relevant, and then the information is displayed directly on satellite maps, essentially. And then it uses tweet and image clickers. Is anybody a volunteer here, by the way? No. I just wanted to check because you would be more of an expert than me. And the maps are created and basically change as real-time information comes in. And so obviously there were tens and thousands of tweets coming out of the Philippines. From what I understand, given that many of the communication networks were down, these were often coming from diaspora rather than from from areas themselves, but obviously that depends on what networks were available where. So in order to quickly sort the data, volunteers were tagging tweets if they were related to either requests for help, infrastructure damage or displaced populations. And every tweet was tagged by 3 different volunteers, and then members of the Standby Volunteer Task Force who were trained, the volunteers are not necessarily trained, would be reviewing it for quality control and then putting it on the map. From a colleague who was involved in the proceedings, she told me that actually in the end only 0.8% of the tweets coming through about the Philippines were tagged, which is obviously a tiny proportion. And she was not sure whether these maps gave any extra information to what the humanitarians already had on the ground. That's an anecdotal piece of evidence, but I think there will certainly be many more reviews coming out about this as we move further on. I wanted to include this because on Patrick Meyer's blog, and I'd really recommend you visit it if you haven't already. It was a very recent blog post about the MIRA. So this is the intercluster rapid assessment tool that we talked about, and he was very impressed how in the report of the MIRA they really were clear about the limitations essentially, and some of those limitations were that the samples were not representative. They couldn't get to all the areas to ask the questions. It was very much convenience sampling, so they couldn't do household kind of beautiful sample size surveys. It was really trying to speak to the barangay captains or someone representing that community. Often the key informants had to guess, so they were trying to guess how many people had lost their homes in their area, or other data like that. The assessment teams were not well trained, so there was variation in how these questionnaires were undertaken in different places. And the Miro were very clear that this still requires validation with secondary data. So they basically did their best to get this information for the use of the humanitarian community, the humanitarian agencies, but there were many holes, essentially. Obviously for Patrick Moore, I think this is interesting because the crisis mapping and social media mapping is often criticised by traditional humanitarian actors. But actually, it faces quite similar challenges, essentially. Obviously, in terms of who's using social media, who's speaking, particularly in areas with no connection, where are these tweets coming in from? Can we really use this as kind of rigorous needs assessment data? Probably not. But what he's said on his blog is arguing that big data isn't all it's cracked up to be is a straw man, pure and simple, because no one should think it's magic to begin with. And I thought this was really interesting because it's really difficult to get representative data and really good rigorous data in a crisis situation, whether you're on the ground or online. And so it's really a case of trying to use all the tools available to us to get as much information as we can, I think, but others may disagree. Okay, I'm going to take it back to our members and what our rapid needs assessments showed in terms of communication. So this is from the said mirror, despite it not being representative and perfect. But you can see they obviously asked a question about what forms of media essentially the population had access to. It's slightly confusingly worded because it's the proportion of population with no access to mass communication and media by domain. And you can see that essentially radio really wins out here. Newspaper, television and internet, in most areas there's high proportion of no access, but radio always higher in every domain. Internews, being a media development agency, are obviously very interested in radio. They carried out a more in-depth study in Guyana, which is where they had they set up an emergency radio station. They actually had a PhD student who came out to help them with this data, which was meant to inform their programme. They may be a bit biased, but they found that radio was the most trusted source of information by the population. They also found, importantly, that the importance of interpersonal communication had increased. So previously, people said they were relying more on television, but now so obviously as the television networks were down, face-to-face communication had become more important. From the needs assessments from ActionAid, World Vision International and UNFPA, who are traditional humanitarian responders and not media development agencies. ActionAid also found that people previously relied on TV and radio, but now there was no electricity and they had to pay to charge their mobile phones, and the information was really flowing through personal networks, from neighbours, through information passed from barangay captains and around like that. World Vision International found the top 3 preferred channels were community leaders, government officials and community volunteers. And UNFPA found that 59% were receiving information through neighbours and community leaders. UNFPA also found they were doing exit interviews from women attending their maternity clinics, maternal health clinics, and they found that the majority of the women attending the clinics had heard about them through the emergency radio stations which had been set up through the programming. In terms of information needs, so you'll remember we talked about communication channels being an important thing to find out. IOM, who's also a network member, are very focused on finding out about information needs. IOM are the lead for the cluster on camp coordination and management, and so they consequently have quite they're in close engagement with with affected populations who have been displaced, essentially. And what they were doing was they were trying to get their community mobilisers to find out what the frequently asked questions were, essentially, amongst the population. I don't know how well you can see, but they talk about, until when will the supply of food support us? My family's feeling emotionally distressed. My family needs medical assistance. Where should I go? My house is severely damaged. How do I get assistance? So questions like these were obviously coming out from the affected community. What IOM will then do is take this information back to the relevant clusters, ask them to provide an answer, and then they were printing posters, flyers, small pamphlets and magazines and distributing them to the local population to try to fill those information need gaps, essentially. That's something which they'd tested before in the response to Typhoon Bofa back in December 2012, and then used it, have been doing again. So, a little bit just about what, amongst our membership, and I can only speak for the members of the CDAC network, what kind of programmes did this information lead members to develop? So, partnership and advocacy to keep emergency radio stations on air. Of the media development agencies, Internews set up an emergency radio station in Guyana, and I'll show you a short clip about their project later. And First Response Radio, who really aimed to get on the ground within 72 hours, they went straight to Tacloban. I think it wasn't 72 hours, but it was a few days after the typhoon hit, basically, and set up an emergency station there. Both these projects only had funding for a matter of weeks. They were proved to be really useful. Feedback from members, for example, from UNFPA's exit surveys, and from people from the population calling in and texting in. It was clear that there was a need for some kind of channel of communication. So in terms of advocacy, the CDAC network obviously advocated to donors. DFID ended up keeping the radio station in Guyana on air it's still on air now, I think, for another couple of months. And in terms of the First Response Radio, a number of NGOs, so UNFPA and World Vision, and also a local organisation, clubbed together and basically provided the funding to keep that on air. Support to get local radio stations back on their feet in dark areas, I guess that should be quiet areas really. Other IMS and other members have been working on trying to support local radio stations to get back up on their feet, and also in doing humanitarian programming, training on humanitarian programming, because often the radio stations that were stationed in these areas were reporting news back to Manila rather than reporting news that was useful for the affected for the community around them. Radio distribution. Obviously, many people's radios were destroyed following the typhoon. So members got together and really advocated for radio distribution to be included in NFI kits, non-food item kits that were being distributed. DFID have started becoming interested in radio stockpiling, so really trying to keep stockpiles of radios around, so if there is a disaster they can be distributed as well. Internews run something called Radio Repair Sundays in Guyana. So far they've repaired 88 radio sets, which, as they point out, is not just for 88 people, but as people share radios, this can help many more people to be connected. I've already talked about the FAQs from IOM. In terms of the NGOs, when we asked them how the kind of needs assessment data that they had affected their programs, they really talked about working closely with community leaders and community mobilisers on aid delivery. So making sure that they were passing important information on to those people and requesting that they pass that on to the community. Ensuring that translated information was available at distribution sites. Many of our members worked with Translators Without Borders to make sure that information was translated accurately and timely, and having community volunteers at help desks for community members to feedback about distributions and ask questions and any comments that they had. Okay, I'm going to just show you another short clip from Internews. And this is Radio Backdoor, so this is the radio station that they set up in Guyana about a week, or just over a week after the typhoon hit.
In Iwan, a town of 50,000 in the Philippines, 150 kilometers east of Tacloban, a small radio station is providing vital community service. When the devastating Typhoon Haiyan, or Yolanda, struck in November, all communication methods, along with public services, were wiped out.
bisan kunta pagkatapos kuntan bag ano may mga pamilya namon dito ay mga kuan waray namon makukontak.
There was no radio, obviously there was no internet, no TV, no newspapers. Just to show how little people knew at that time about what was going on outside of Giwan. One of the first questions that we got when we got out of the car was like, how is Manila? Is Manila okay? So there was no means of information whatsoever. It was clear from the start that if you ever would see an information gap or an information need, it was here in Giwan.
Dili kami maarang kung ano nga barangay, saan unang barangay tatagan yung relief. So ito, makuri, dili kami maarang kung anong oras.
Amid the rubble and destruction, Giwan had one unexpected asset, a standing tower, ideal to put up an antenna and start broadcasting. International NGO Internews banded together with local DJs whose stations had been destroyed by the storm and launched Radio Bakdao, Radio Rise.
That we want to get the communication going, that we want to bridge the gap, not only between the humanitarian partners, the international organizations, but also local government. And this radio station can help to listen to the community, to hear what they have to say.
All of the agencies. In a short time, broadcasting music and news about relief, aid, and reconstruction, and making listeners' voices a part of the station, Radio Bakdao has become part of the community.
Nakakapanood na kami balita kung so galit siya na may dayan ang mga kanya haamang mga tanging relief. So dako ko pakabulig ito ng radyo niya, Radio Bakdao. Nadaog kami radyo kung may da namon mga problema. Pinataga naman nirahin kumbaga kuan answer. Nasusolusyonan nira.
Radyo naman yan is more on public service hiya. 100% pinapamatayan itong boses ito ng mga tao.
Mas maupay yan na okay. Nagkikar na ba herayan na kaysahan una. Napifil na namon eras pag-servisyo haamon.
We want to help and we want to listen so that the more feedback we get, the better also the humanitarian partners can tailor their services towards the needs and the feedback that they're getting. We really want to make sure that the recovery goes as well as possible.
May kita ako expectation na talaga maging maiha pa ba itong servisyo dinhi itong Radyo Bakdao kay para makabulig ngayon makapamatihira itong mga boses itong mga tao nga naghahangyo nangangaro bulig.
92.9 Radyo Bakdao.
Okay. Okay. So you can see from that video about Radio Bakdao that that gave some good insights from the community, and I think that for the humanitarian responders, so for the other network members, they found the radio station is really helpful in providing information about relief distributions and other like health education messages, water education, whatever they need to communicate, but also in terms of getting feedback. I know that Radio Abante, which is the radio in Tacloban, receives up to 100 texts a day, which they will then feed back to the clusters, whether that be negative feedback, concerns, questions, and then they will try to respond to those. They'll explain that message has been fed through, and then they'll try to respond where there's been questions. So it's, in the areas where those radio stations are, I think it's really important. It's kind of the middleman in terms of two-way communication. However, these are only in two areas. Increasingly, as other communities, radio stations get back on their feet, but the coverage is quite limited still at the moment. Okay, I just wanted to quickly touch on some other uses of technology which members were using in the response. And this is obviously, again, only CDAC Network members, and I'm sure I'm missing many others which other actors have used. In terms of needs assessment, Plan International and World Vision were using smartphones to collect data. Plan International were using something called Poi Mapper. I don't know if anyone's heard of that, but basically they were collecting data on smartphones, entering it in, and then that was being sent straight back to a server to be analysed quickly and to be passed on to decision makers as quickly as possible. World Vision were using something similar. I don't think it was PoiMapper. And Internews have not yet used it, but they have a humanitarian data toolkit which they've been developing. And it's quite interesting to read about that. They have the whole kit. They have smartphones, portable solar panels. They have option for paper questionnaires and smartphone entry, and then you can scan the paper questionnaires. Anyway, it's a big kit. It's very interesting, but essentially uses the same idea, using smartphones in order to be able to process the data very quickly and use that to make decisions. The World Vision Speed Evidence Project, has anybody heard of that? This was something which World Vision actually applied to the Humanitarian Innovation Fund to pilot, and they were developing it, and then Typhoon Haiyan came along and they just decided, okay, this is a good opportunity to try this out. It's essentially, they're testing it out within their own staff and their own kind of sphere at the moment, but it's about information management, and it's trying to manage, it's a kind of platform which can receive texts from staff, from World Vision staff, also from communities, and then it tries to monitor social media as well for tweets and emails and messages coming through, and then it tries to analyse that information and essentially display it in a way which is easy for decision makers to read and use. They've got quite an interesting blog about the development and kind of testing it out, which is probably worth having a look at if you're interested. Frontline SMS, I guess most people have heard of Frontline. Yeah, so they're also a member, and their software is increasingly used and was used for doing text blasts in the Philippines, but once mobile networks were up and running, but also in terms of radio stations managing text messages coming in, and hotlines which were also set up managing text messages coming in order to be able to to respond and using online. Okay, I just gave a little list of things that I've referred to and other things which might be interesting to read. This is the Left in the Dark policy briefing which the CDAC Network was founded on. It's kind of old now, but it's still worth looking at. OCHA recently released a policy report called Humanitarianism in the Network Age, which gives, it's quite thick, but it gives a good indication of different technologies being used now in humanitarianism, and actually mostly how humanitarian agencies are very far behind in terms of innovation and using up-to-date communication technologies. There is the World Disaster Report also is along the same theme. There's an HPN network paper which basically talks about the lessons learned from the Info's Aid project, which is quite interesting as well. This is about the Humanitarian Data Toolkit, so the Internews Centre for Innovation. They released their final report in August. Quick link to Patrick Meyer's blog, because he always has interesting debates and discussions on his blog posts, and that's the World Vision Speed Evidence blog as well. I think that's all. I can leave that for you if you want to jot anything down.
Thank you so much. So, any questions for Nicki?
Hi. So I'm Gili, I'm an MSc student here, and previously I was a bit involved with the Satellite Sentinel project, which monitored did crisis mapping in Sudan, and was on the other side of the Patrick Meyer pro big data crowdsourced debate. So just full disclosure in a sense.
Sure,
my question is sort of follow up on that point, or on the argument that you were making on his behalf, in a sense that of course big data is not all it's cracked up to be, we shouldn't expect it to be, but that doesn't mean that you can sort of take down its contribution. What that doesn't seem to take into account, I think, is that it does come at the expense of other analysis, comes at the expense of resources when you focus on collecting data in a certain way and analyzing it automatically and mapping it in that sense, versus sort of the perhaps slower process of sense making that a human analyst would make. And if along all of these initiatives, does that sort of factor in, and is there any measurement or account for the analysis not done based on these tools?
So the kind of opportunity cost, right?
Exactly.
So when you spend your time doing this, then you can't spend your time doing this. That's a very good question, and I'm not sure that I would know enough about it to be able to answer. I think that, I mean, I think certainly in the Philippines response, I mean, from talking to my colleague anecdotally, she's very involved as a volunteer, and she said it was how useful was all that time and energy, right? I mean, it's volunteers working, so you're not paying for it essentially, but it's still people's time and energy, and could they be using that for something else? And her sense, I think, was pretty much this was not a great use of time, because actually everything that we found out was already known. So I'm sorry, I'm not a real expert on it. I thought Patrick Murray's blog was interesting because we're often thinking about the kind of constraints in terms of rapid research and trying to collect needs assessment data, and how it's so often flawed. And I don't think that crisis mapping is by any means a let's do that instead kind of thing, because I think you clearly need to try to get information from as many sources as you possibly can. But I'm sorry not to be able to answer your question better.
Can I just build on that question a bit, though?
Sure.
I guess what I'm interested in is who's actually using this crisis mapping.
Who's using the data?
Yeah, what's being done with it?
Well, OCHA activated the network, essentially, in that sense. And so they were really trying to get a quick picture, initially, because it was activated before the storm hit, a quick picture of what was coming through on social media from different areas, in the hope, I guess, that they would be able to get information before anyone was on the ground to be able to go and visit and find out what the damage was. And a lot of the discussion around it was also where are the gaps? You know, if nothing's coming from these areas, that requires investigation. So in terms of who's using it in our membership, OCHA are obviously a member, and I know that they're using it to find out where they need to investigate more, essentially. In terms of Internews, are also using it in terms of reaching out to radio stations that have been damaged and destroyed. The media development agencies were using it in that way, but that's obviously a very specific use. I would hope, although I wouldn't be able, it would be interesting to speak more in depth to somebody from OCHA about this, that it would begin to map out where the extent of the damage, how much money you might need, how much money you might need in order to be able to respond in those areas. Although I'm not entirely sure about that.
I guess the worry again is that you just have unknown unknowns, right? And then if you're
rather than any more in-depth information.
Right. So if you're acting on those data rather than
and OCHA have been pretty clear that they're not acting. That it's a process of trying to get more information, but that it's not going to be ever going to be the only decision-making tool, because it wouldn't be reliable enough, right? It's kind of a case of trying to scrabble for quick information quickly. It's also quite new, so I think that there's obviously Patrick Murray's a big advocate for it, but then there's obviously still a lot of kind of analysis that will need to be done, and I'm sure, particularly post Typhoon Haiyan, because in the Philippines there's so much mobile use, which is not the case in all disasters and all situations, and so I'm sure there'll be a lot of analysis ongoing about whether this was useful or was it a complete waste of time. I know in Haiti, in Haiti, when there was a lot of this started really almost organically, because there were tweets coming in, social media messaging coming in from all over the place. Yeah. And it was very much seen as an opportunity. The affected, communities affected by disaster being able to express their voice in a way, which is maybe more interesting. And Ushahidi mapping has been used for example, in the Kenyan elections and pre-elections, and in terms of determining where outbreaks of violence happening and things like that. So maybe that is where its use is, right? Yeah,
but I guess the worry is maybe not to frame it as something that's useful versus a waste of time, but maybe a third option being actively harmful, and if it's directing resources into...
If it is indeed directing resources,
right.
Yeah. And at the moment, the people that are using it, as far as I can tell, are saying this will never be the only thing that we'll base our decision making on. So yeah, as far as I'm aware.
Thanks.
Hi.
I'm Evan. I'm an MSc student as well. It might tie into the idea of big data, but I mean, the title of the talk is how to best communicate with communities affected by disaster, but it seems very much how to communicate one way with communities affected by disaster. And the big data might be kind of a byproduct of systems already in place, but are there any organizations working at, kind of the last slide might have gotten at it, but empowering the community to get there? You mentioned having their voice heard, but maybe in more structured ways, or empowering them with tools that aggregate that local information at the individual citizen level.
In terms of technological solutions, or in
Or
terms of kind of generally?
Any information or reporting. It just seems like the radio stations would be able to say, there's aid going to be distributed here, and that's wonderful that the community can hear that. Whereas a system that said, hey, where is the road blocked in your neighborhood? Where is the most need in individuals reporting? Is there any individual reporting system kind of out there or being developed by any of these
agencies? Well, the whole premise of being able to go out and do a needs assessment is essentially to try to find out what's going on. And a lot of what we were kind of just talking about Haiti was really people sending in messages saying, this is the situation here, and a lot of the tweets that come through in the Philippines, particularly, I'm more familiar with in the Manila floods. There were lots of stories of people sending through messages to the UN agencies on their Facebook pages or on Twitter and saying, you know, my neighbours are stuck in their house, they can't get out, and you know, so the Philippines, as we said, is quite far ahead in terms of use of social media and mobile technology, and so the government in the Philippines they develop a hashtag every time there's a disaster, given that there are quite a few. Unfortunately, but you know they've really developed. In that way they're far ahead of the humanitarian agencies. Really, they have hashtag. I think it was Haiyan or Yolanda Relief, and which will go straight through to the government, and they will try. I presume will try to find a way to respond in that particular area.
Is that maybe if I'm just misunderstanding? Sorry to pull people on, but is that different than the big data that we're talking about being used or not used? What
I guess in terms of the big data, like the crisis mapping digital humanitarian network it's sort of volunteer and technical communities, whereas with what the Philippine government are doing is they're kind of asking people to highlight things directly to them, essentially.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of basically saying this is giving different options for contact. So they also set up hotlines. Which people can text into or call to report. I mean, I guess because due to focusing on our network members, I've kind of focused on how you might want to report complaints about food distribution, or you might want to ask questions. Actually, obviously, in the initial stages, it's really more about saying, my house, you know, someone's trapped under this house, someone's, you know, and so that's where it gets really interesting, I think, in terms, particularly in the Philippines with their government. Really trying to kind of make sure that every channel of communication can be used in terms of asking for help. Does that help?
Yeah. No, it does.
Yeah.
Just curious, sort of in the long term. So you mentioned, so for example, Difford have been funding this radio station, or however. So and then eventually that funding runs out. So what happens to that infrastructure that's there, or if there's been a rollout of sort of like radios or whatever this sort of technology is, what actually happens to that technology afterwards?
Well, in terms of the radio stations which Internews and First Response Radio have been working on, they're all being run by local teams now. So obviously when local radio stations were destroyed after the disaster, there was people with no jobs left. And so they really tried to bring in local journalists to work on those. In terms of funding them, I guess the the strategic hope would be that they would become funded by the community, so that they're, you know, in the same way as a community radio station would be funded anywhere, and that, but through advertising and through possibly some funding from the government as well. And in terms of the rollout of radio, so radio distribution, I guess. Yeah, I guess people would keep those radios and use them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just sort of curious whether or not there's a sort of, okay, now that this whole thing is kind of like
blown over,
we need all that equipment back now, or is there
yeah.
actually a capacity building that's going
Yeah.
on in that community around the technology,
Yeah.
or capacity building, or sort of sort of technological.
Yeah. Yeah, and what I should really explain about the media development agencies is this is really a tiny part of what they do. The kind of humanitarian response stuff is quite a small part of what they do. They're really more, as the name suggests, kind of trying to develop media in different countries in different contexts.
Yeah.
They do a lot of training of journalists. In terms of funding, I guess it's a kind of funding the initial setup and then trying to get that to be taken on by community. I think the clip shows that the community, and particularly in Guyana, really appreciated that that radio station. I liked how they said, we go there for answers and we get them, kind of thing, which is not, I don't know, I think that's an interesting byproduct of a radio station. So yeah. Hello.
I read something in some of the other disasters about kind of different competing technologies or mediums which kind of somehow get in the way of each other on the ground when these things happen. I just wondered if you found that, on if there was the presence of any organisation which kind of pushed towards, oh, we should all use this platform, or was there just kind of organised chaos with lots of different platforms, like different crisis platforms or different firms or these type of things? Yeah, I could give kind of two answers to that. In terms of so UN OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, they are really ramping up their capacity in terms of communication with communities' work, and they're trying to kind of develop these working groups basically, so that people from different clusters come and they talk about the messaging that they get, messages that they want to get out, to try to ensure there's no duplication of messaging, and think about ways that they could and try to organise community consultations so that people are going out into communities, finding out what the needs are and bringing that information back. So that was really, there was really kind of a need was defined basically for coordination. I know in the response in Haiti, for example, everyone got very excited about sending text messages, and local communities became people became overwhelmed. You can't receive a text message every 2 seconds telling you to boil your water, or or not boil your water, depending on where the message is coming from. And so that's really been defined as kind of a need to coordination, and for somebody who's just had the roof blown off their house, they're probably not really interested whether you're from Plan International or the UNFPA, or so it's this kind of idea that the humanitarian response should be working as one in terms of communication. There's still quite a long way to go because it's not a cluster in itself. There's no communication cluster. It's really about kind of opt-in from different agencies. In terms of different platforms competing, I think there's, I haven't seen too much of that actually, but that's maybe because I've been really working with our members who have been relatively well coordinated. As soon as the Typhoon Haiyan hit, I think as soon as it made landfall, there was a kind of an instant Skype group set up. Everybody was talking about what they were doing, and it was actually relatively interesting to see, and we're doing this, okay, well, we'll go over here then, and but I have no doubt that happens. I mean, I think in every particularly large-scale humanitarian emergency, there's, with a lot of goodwill, everybody wants to help, but maybe it results in some overlap. What were the particular situation you were thinking about? I can't remember the exact one. I think it was one of the ones, it may have been a tsunami, when I think there was 2 or 3, there was like Ushahidi and some Google platform and maybe some other humanitarian one, which all kind of like gathering some data. I can't remember the details, it was just something I read. And saying that there was, in some ways, like having not a single platform but 3, which kind of reduced the potential of kind of aggregating and being a go-to. But I just wondered if these were issues that maybe the UN had somehow kind of said, oh, you're all going to use this platform, or there were people within, these groups like your organisation who kind of somehow talked about this and defined a kind of common platform that people use. That kind of my question, really.
I mean, I think that's really the aim of the CDAC network, but obviously we have a certain membership and there's other actors involved. I think OCHA actually coordinate this group on the ground, and given that they do have a mandate for coordination, I think I think there's potential for success, but it's still relatively new, so it needs to sort of be tried and tested, I guess. Any more questions? Hey.
Did you get any experience on where the mapping worked better and where it didn't work so well? Was it a matter of that there's still some basic communication networks in place, or mobile penetration beforehand, or the community's communication habits? Where was the data of better quality and where was it of worse quality?
I would not be able to answer that question. I know, in terms of countrywide, in the Philippines in general, there's a lot more data coming through because there is very high rate mobile penetration pretty much everywhere. But it was a question that I was really asking to my colleague who was involved in this, was, well, communication networks were down, where were these tweets coming from, And I think, that there is some, people need to get in touch with their family. The Philippines also has a huge diaspora working all over the world, and so there's going to be contact as soon as there can be, essentially, with the outside world through that means. Even if somebody who's in an area which has been affected isn't going straight on Twitter going, oh, better let the rest of the world know, it could be family members doing that. So no, I don't actually have, it was some information I was hoping to get, but I think that will come out as we see sort of analyses of this response and how well it worked. Sorry not to be able to answer.
Thanks.
I have a question. I kind of have two questions. That I think it's kind of the perception of big data from the humanitarian sector is kind of interesting. As you said, it's sort of like a relatively new thing for humanitarians in the UN. And this comment about it maybe not being useful, or that they kind of got information that they already knew. Do you think that part of that is because there isn't this really well-defined kind of consumer of the information, like going back to Mark's point, that because it is a sort of like network and not just a coordination body trying to like give very generic information actually to a wide range of people who are providing really loads of different services, and that perhaps the humanitarian sector don't really know what they can do, what they really want from big data. And so, do you think that's part of, I guess, the problem, and this maybe stagnation really of like being able to really embrace with big data and some of the technologies that are available?
I think definitely. The two agencies I mentioned who I feel did use it were OCHA and Internews. Internews, as we know, they have a Department of Innovation. They're always trying to push the boundaries in this sense. They have a clear idea they have many ideas about how they might be able to use it. OCHA, I think they have some key people within OCHA who are particularly interested in the potential, and so but I must say the way I've seen it working is always as kind of something which exists, but I'm not really sure how many agencies really look at it, really look at it and think, what does this mean? I think it would be something I think we've got an opportunity within the CDAC network actually to investigate that, because we do have a relatively diverse membership, and it would be interesting to see how they perceive it. And I would imagine it probably comes down to a bit of an individual basis. I think it's often one of those things that if you have someone within an organisation who's interested, then it might get taken somewhere. But I think it's probably, was it Mark? I think it's also probably because a lot of the issues that you highlighted, could it be potentially dangerous to take this as real or as, as gospel? Like,
how much did so you mentioned like lots of the kind of like needs assessment that was done in Haiyan, and that out of that different programs were designed. How much did agencies genuinely use each other's data as opposed to kind of just use the data that they had collected originally anyway? Because that was related to the funding they'd had and the resources they could provide.
Yeah, of course. That's always a question, and I think for a long time there's been a push to try to not waste too many resources everybody doing an individual needs assessment, but really try to get these multi-agency assessments done. But often for individual agencies, they don't get enough information about their particular mandate. It's always a bit of a fight to try to get your questions on, the questions that you need the information to respond. I don't know how well agencies shared data in the whole response. I had the task of going through all the needs assessments that were posted on the OCHA Philippines One Response website. There were hundreds. I mean, it would take years to read to read all of that. In terms of how the network shared their data, it's a little bit easier because we're essentially asking 2 questions really, and so anybody who had done a needs assessment and included those questions was essentially saying this is what we found out about communication in this area. Obviously, those questions were part of much bigger needs assessments, which were more focused on their particular needs. I mean, UNFPA was about pregnant women. Save the Children was obviously focused on the needs of children. But I found it was relatively well shared within this group. Anyway, there seemed to be quite people seem to be quite keen to try to get this data and share it.
If I can, will bit probably on Mark's question. What do you really mean by when you talk about big data? So is there actually somebody just looking at Twitter, or are they getting general Twitter data, or just following some hashtag? So if I tweet something with the hashtag to be seen and maybe considered, whereas if, I don't know, somebody actually there just misspelled the hashtag or doesn't use it, is just lost? Or is it, how can you know that if somebody's tweeting from there, from somewhere else, or if it's me calling my mother in Italy, telling her to tweet something, or
how can you verify it essentially? Is that what you're asking?
How verify? And second, I mean, how are these data used? So how has been used? So is there actually hundreds of people reading incoming tweets, or?
So I believe the way that they kind of manage. So you have these different organisations. So the Standby Task Force, for example, I think someone is essentially responsible for giving those tweets to different volunteers, because I mentioned that it'll be like 3 volunteers that read each tweet, and then using Micromapper anyway. So then they'll say very relevant, not relevant, and then that will go to somebody else, and then eventually that will be verified by somebody who's been trained to do that. How much you can verify it, I'm not really sure. I saw the, and I'm not actually sure how they do it. I can't answer that question properly. I know that the BBC have a, what is it called? Audience participation arm, where they're constantly working on ways of how to verify video, like YouTube videos or data that comes in from different sources, because as you say, I mean, examples in conflict areas, for example, people may send in videos that are really highlighting something like a human rights atrocity that's going on in that area, and what's the responsibility of the BBC, for example, to verify that before putting it out as news, right? And so I think that the volunteer and tech communities are trying to kind of create similar guidelines, but I have no idea how they do it. And in terms of filtering through all the tweets, I'm not really sure either. I mean, I think that different volunteers or different groups of volunteers have responsibility for different parts of social media, essentially.
From some of the members I've spoken to from the Digital Humanitarian Network, I get the impression a lot of it is very manual. And that's why they have this like massive volunteer.
They have so many people doing it, right? Yeah. But I wouldn't be able to say exactly who's kind of sitting at the top going, what how that, do you have any idea how that works?
So it's more like crowdsourcing rather than big data.
Yeah, it's essentially more crowdsourcing, yeah.
I mean, you could do the same with the phone or text messages. It's not strictly related to the internet or to this kind of...
I think the volunteers are going through the open source data.
Yeah, but the World Vision platform that I talked about there was that kind of, it should be able to accept information from phone, from email, from different sources.
For instance, Twitter, if they collect data through the Twitter API, for instance, those are probably 10 or 20% of the actual tweets. And so, whereas if they actually go to Twitter, I mean, either how could you coordinate hundreds of people, not to everybody looks at through all the tweets? I mean, I found it, I don't know, I have to be there probably to understand, but I found it really risky, going back to to have a huge number of a waste of time and a huge number of both false positive and false negative. So I think it's pretty risky at this point.
Yeah, and the time investment that it takes, right? Because it's not just a few people doing it. I mean, it's a lot of volunteers working on that. Yeah, I wouldn't want to pretend to be too much of an expert on it. So I would really recommend reading a bit more. I mean, as we said, Patrick Murray is one side of the coin, but I think that he also mentions a lot of the criticisms of it and how it works. But it's certainly interesting. It's interesting to consider. I think maybe naively something I think is quite nice is the idea that there are people all over the world kind of willing to participate in some way, and I guess it's human nature in a way, wanting to help in some way, and whether it's effective or not, I guess remains to be seen.
Absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's just technologically challenge, I think, to get it effective. I mean, to make it effective.
Well, there's quite a lot of different stages where it can fall down, isn't there? I guess, like who's actually doing the tweeting. That's going to depend on first of all who has connectivity. Maybe could be to do with wealth in a lot of places. Age, like younger people are more likely to tweet than older people. Vulnerability. So there's already, where is that information coming from? For a start, how much of it is being picked up? Who's deciding whether it's relevant or not? There's many stages where there's holes, right? And then how can we verify it? And I think they're working on those things, but I'm not quite sure of kind of where the most recent lines are drawn, as it were.
I just have one last question, unless anyone else. So maybe this is like more of a thought rather than something that's very obvious at the moment, but one of the criticisms that came out of Haiti and the kind of, I think it mentions it in the HINA report, about like the mass communication and what maybe new technologies are offering in the emergency context, are that there is more an opportunity for affected communities to have a voice and communicate with each other, and that's actually quite powerful. And so one of the observations from Haiti was that that's quite threatening actually to NGOs and the UN, because they don't have control over that. And that I haven't seen it like discussed that much, but I wondered if from the network that is a discussion that people are having, or people are aware of it, or if it is just something that was said once and might just rear its head a bit later as it becomes more a reality.
I think it's probably one of the reasons that humanitarian agencies are a bit behind, is just not quite knowing. You can control, as someone mentioned earlier, it sounds like it is very one way often, and that was a big criticism at the beginning of Haiyan actually. It was that everyone had gone mad with messaging. Everyone's getting their messages out, but isn't really concentrating on trying to get any messages back. It's not even really about messages, it's about listening, right, and communicating and really engaging in dialogue about how what people need and how what is the role of the humanitarian actor in providing that, and what can people do for themselves. And I think that really came out in the HINA report. That was a really big part, wasn't it, that people are communicating with each other all the time, and that's really what's important. And humanitarian actors are kind of a bit behind on that, trying to catch up now, but still seeing this as a very sort of linear transaction. Linear communication essentially between humanitarian and community, rather than thinking about the whole big web of communication, which ultimately can be more interesting in an innovation sense, really. But I think, of course, it's threatening to traditional humanitarian actors in one way, because like, are we still needed, right? Is that kind of what you're?
Yeah, I just wondered how much it's on the radar of your network members, or if it actually comes up, and do people just ignore that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely on the radar, and I think that's why people are interested. That's why agencies are interested in being part of the network. But we've definitely got a really long way to go to kind of. It's part of the vision of the network, But I think we've got a long way to go to make that. Something which is actively debated and acted upon. So yeah, to be seen.
Is there anything else before we go to wine, which should be outside? Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much, Nicki. And
thank you for coming. Thank you for interesting questions as well. It was good to discuss.
Great. And if you want to continue any discussions, we've got wine outside, so please stay with us. Thank you.